Thank you and you, Byron. Let's do this. This album reeks of an underdeveloped group who haven't quite found their feet yet. The majority of songs on this sound like they were written out of obligation as opposed to passion, as if they'd just been commissioned to write their first album, didn't have enough songs, and had to shit out a few more to warrant an album's worth. Which, don't get me wrong, probably was the case, but they definitely should have thought more considerately about it. There are rare exceptions that I'll return to every now and then, like Carousel, M&M's and Wasting Time, which I actually really like, but even they're reaching for quality a bit. For every half-decent chorus on this album is a lackluster verse melody, which for the most part sounds like it's being made up as it goes along, combined with lyrics that are funny at best and at worst painfully mediocre, resulting in a pretty boring listening experience. This album doesn't shy away from being instrumentally driven at times, with intros that take up almost half the song, which I wouldn't complain about if not for their inconsistency in substance. For example, tracks like Carousel and Cacophony have these more instrumentally dialed back intros with melodic bass lines and relaxed drumming, which on an album like this are a breath of fresh air, but they're cheapened by Tom's muddy distortion pedal almost every time, and worse yet without building on the layers they just established, which as you can imagine is very anticlimactic. And a shame because those moments of subtlety are vastly favourable to me on an album where every track elsewhere is going balls to the wall with every instrument going off at once. Which I wouldn't mind if, like I mentioned, the songs were melodically and lyrically more interesting. Having said that though, the production isn't exactly a saving grace either. This album sounds like shit. It hardly sounds like the instruments have even been mixed, it just sounds like they were left exactly as they were recorded, without volume adjustment even. All things considered, these guys are a three-piece and yet the bass may well not even be there. It's super hard to hear at points.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
In the 2 years between the release of Cheshire Cat and this album, the boys certainly stepped their game up in a major way. Dude Ranch feels like the album Cheshire Cat tried to be and failed. The songs are much more structurally sound, with dynamic instrumentation that knows when to hold back and when to rock out in equal measure. The vocals melodically are a lot catchier too, and when complemented by these harmonic backing vocals sound really satisfying. They aid the song's oomph in a way I wish Cheshire Cat explored a bit more, fleshing the vocals out as more of a defining staple of the song as opposed to the instrumentals, which on this album in particular definitely would not have worked. Dude Ranch is a very thematic album I feel, where most of the tracks wouldn't hold much weight as standalones but sound great in the context of a whole listening experience, so that's how I'd recommend you listen to the album. Like any normal person would.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
If I'm listening to Blink, 9 times out of 10 it's a song off this album. It's just great. While, as I mentioned earlier, Cheshire Cat is more instrumentally driven and Dude Ranch by vocals, Enema of the State meets gracefully in the middle, with tracks that kick off with instantly engaging riffs that are guaranteed to spark your excitement, followed appropriately by Tom and Mark's spunky vocals that come at you with these punchy melodies that stick in your head like glue. This album is definitely more calculated than their previous work, and although most of these tracks are a bit formulaic, the songwriting and guitar work is just good enough to where it doesn't matter. The importance of instrumental dynamics is built upon even more so on this album too, with Hoppers taking centre stage with his bass and really coming into his own during the verses of most of these tracks, making the anticipation of the inevitable crescendo of guitars and vocal melodies all the more captivating. DeLonge adopts these muted chords which accompany his own vocals in particular in a way that really gives the songs a real edge that's super satisfying, and the album's production is great. Everything is mixed more or less to perfection. The only gripe I have with this album are the last 3 tracks. Not that they're bad or anything, but on an album as consistently brilliant as this, they come off as kind of forgettable to me, like they should have been B-sides or bonus tracks or something, which is not an ideal way to end your defining album, I'll be honest.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it!
Who could forget Blink-182's Be Here Now? I could. To give this album the benefit of the doubt, it's undeniably good and I enjoy it, but I can't bring myself to say much more about it than that. It certainly suffers from being the follow-up to the band's masterpiece, which, don't get me wrong, is never easy, and had this been the predecessor to Enema of the State, I wouldn't have cause to slag it off for the reasons that I am. But it just feels like such a step backwards to me. In trying to adopt Enema of the State's signature sound, they've essentially created a B-Tech version of it. I've got no problem with a band blatantly riding on the success of their previous work, but in doing so you've got to be progressive and make it sound new and interesting, which Blink simply didn't do. If anything, they subtracted elements that made Enema of the State enjoyable. I can't off the top of my head name a song on this album with a catchy riff, and the verse melodies sound kind of generic and lackluster, especially on Roller Coaster, Every Time I Look For You and Please Take Me Home. Granted, the choruses more than make up for that most of the time, but at what cost, Blink? Not to mention the blatant gimmickry on tracks like First Date, Happy Holidays You Bastard, and Give Me One Good Reason, where it sounds like Tom and Mark are desperately trying to appease what the general public think a Blink song should sound like. It's alright at the end of the day, but it just strikes me as a letdown to release what is more or less the same album. But I'm gonna have to get used to that.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it! I could tell it.
This album stylistically is certainly a lot different to their past four in a way I would welcome if not for them half-arsing it so bad. Some of these songs try so hard to stray from Blink's conventional sound and song structure to where they end up having very few memorable attributes, while others pussyfoot around potential experimentality for a fleeting moment before deciding, hey, you know what, f*** it, this is just a bog-standard Blink song. The result of which being the album sounding really thematically confused, which is disappointing because had this whole album delivered the kind of experimentality showcased on its interludes, for example, I may have been giving it more credit. Even the more pants and jacket sounding tracks like Here's Your Letter and Go do a better job of sparking my interest than the ballads on the latter half of this album. Like, Jesus lads, try not to bore me to death. The choruses are sometimes quite catchy, like on Feeling This, I Miss You and Always, but by God have you got to put up with some sorry verses before these songs obtain any enjoyability. Tom DeLonge's spoken word vocal delivery on some of these tracks, although a stylistic choice, often end up sounding more like they just couldn't be asked to come up with a vocal melody, and severely lack oomph as a result, accompanied by Mark Hoppus chiming in with these snappy, repetitious vocal takes on tracks like Feeling This, Down and Easy Target, which to me just feel like such a cheap and lazy ploy to try and make these verses stick in your head. In summary, it's a bit of a mess, and as much as I commend their efforts in striving for a different sound, they just had to go in harder than this.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it! I could tell it.
It's alright. It's a lot more thematically solid than self-titled, and its bleak tone sounds like it actually comes from somewhere genuine, where on self-titled it sounded more like they were just desperately reaching for something different sounding. But does that make it interesting? Not really, especially seeing as how this was their first release in 8 years. It's listenable, it's enjoyable, and much like Pants and Jacket, that's kind of it. I like Natives though.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it! I could tell it.
You know, normally in preparation for my write-ups of these albums, I'll listen to them at least twice, maybe more if I enjoyed it, but I'd really rather move on from this one as soon as possible. It's not like I'll remember it regardless of however many times I listen to it. Any smidgen of individualism Blink as a band left behind on Neighbourhoods is just lost on California completely. I could sense that was eventually going to be the case, but it still hurts, man. The lack of self-awareness in Blink's attempt to essentially rewrite their early work while at the same time retaining nothing of what made it enjoyable, it's just painful. The most obvious of which being the absence of Tom DeLonge, who, if present on this project, I dare say would have made it at least 15% more enjoyable. His angsty tone of voice was essential to their sound and at the least gave the songs a smidgen of memorability when the songwriting wasn't up to par. And Skiba in comparison is just so naff, I'm sorry, his voice just doesn't do it for me. And, in my opinion, contributes to what makes this album so boring. Additionally, without being a massive Blink fan myself, I can acknowledge that what made them so likeable to begin with was their relatability. So tell me how in God's name I'm meant to relate to a singer whose voice has been auto-tuned to such an extent where they no longer sound human, and whose songs are mixed so tightly to the point of imperfection. Do you guys not see the irony there? Not to mention Skiba's incessant, obnoxious backing vocals whose only function are to tell the listener, we really don't give a shit, and it shows. This was the first time I genuinely wanted an album to end, but certainly not the last. The title track and the chorus of Los Angeles were decent, aside from that, pretty lame.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it! I could tell it.
Take everything I just said about California, except this time the writing is worse. F*** you.
Mohammed, I'd like to say the word, damn it! I could tell it.
And now for the ranking, coming at you in 3, 2, 1. So that's that. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment your personal Blink-182 album rankings. I'm genuinely interested to hear what they are. And next time, Radiohead.